What if psychedelics could heal trauma? Neuroscience is uncovering the answer.
I have my PhD in neuropharmacology, and I'm a person with 12 years of sobriety. So I had a really bad accident and a traumatic brain injury. Fast forward 10 or so years, I was an intravenous heroin addict. And 13 years ago to the day, I was in the basement of a hospital. I had track marks up and down my arms. I was miserable, at times suicidal, unemployed and unemployable. I saw neuroscience as an outlet to potentially figure a way to get at whatever happens to the brain following trauma, stop it there before it becomes a psychiatric illness. Psychedelics are able to provide a rapid-acting and long-lasting shift for people.
Join us as we sit down with Dr. Devin Effinger to break down how addiction is hijacking the brain and why psychedelics might just be the key to healing trauma at its roots. So, Dr. Effinger, can you describe and break down for us how addiction works in the brain?
Absolutely. Yeah, so before, let me take a little sort of a backtrack here and just describe sort of what makes human beings as advanced as we are, as compared to, so a lot of the work that's been done studying addiction has been in more simple creatures like, rodents or non-human primates. And part of what makes human beings so advanced but also so susceptible to these complex psychiatric disorders is we have this highly developed prefrontal cortex that allows us to predict outcomes and so on and so forth.
It's a survival mechanism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, with addiction, part of what makes human beings similar to these animals is that we have these like evolutionarily conserved circuits, meaning that you see the same sort of reward pathways or similar reward pathways in a rodent all the way up to a human being.
Okay.
And that allows us to be successful as a species. As a cave people, if you found very sweet berries and you ate those berries, they tasted good. The dopamine release and the activation of this reward pathway would instill like a new memory of when I find this bush, I need to eat these berries because it's good for my survival.
Okay.
Now that brain that we have was never prepared for exposure to something as stimulating as drugs of abuse.
Yeah.
And so these drugs, through different, depending on the drugs, different pathways, ultimately act on this mesolimbic reward pathway. And what can happen is that chronic exposure to drugs of abuse can lead to what we would call, receptor downregulation. When there's too much activation in the brain's response would be to pull receptors in order to slow the activation. So it's like when there's dopamine release, the cells on the other side that are receiving the dopamine have receptors and they get activated. And when there's too much activation, you just pull back some of those receptors so that you can slow down.
Is this why you return to lower the baseline with dopamine whenever you elicit such a response?
Yeah, so you can imagine that over time the brain becomes used to you using these drugs to stimulate massive amounts of dopamine. So it's pulled back these receptors, and so when you pull away the drug, you have less dopamine receptors, which would amount to a blunted feeling of pleasure, just in general.
Yeah.
And that's just with like drugs that are acting on dopamine systems. It's like with benzodiazepines, you pull those drugs, all of a sudden you have overexcitation, which would be like high amounts of anxiety, or potentially seizures, like this, similar with alcohol when you're messing with the GABA system. So all that to say that's sort of what perpetuates the cycle of like when somebody stops, they feel really down, it's hard for them to return to baseline, and so they return back to the drug of abuse to get the same level of stimulation that their brains become accustomed to.
Interesting.
And then beyond that, we lose the ability for top-down control, meaning the prefrontal cortex that is really responsible for like inhibition and like logical thinking.
Execution, executive control.
Yeah, exactly. Over time, that reward pathway becomes, overly stimulated, and then the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and these regions within that reward pathway, it becomes altered, and so somebody with a use disorder is sort of operating in a situation where they don't have the ability to have complete agency over their thoughts and actions around the drug of abuse, regardless of all the consequences they continue to use the drug.
So that's addiction, and that's how it works in the brain. How has that influenced your own personal journey? And I'm guessing that gives you a unique perspectives and insights into what your focus is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so as I alluded to, I've been sober for a long time, and my back story, I'm not going to get into it, but essentially there was a lot of trauma early in my life. I had a really bad accident, a traumatic brain injury, and basically at an early age learned that drugs offered relief or from the way that I was feeling inside. And I sort of outsourced having to deal with discomfort. Fast forward 10 or so years, I was an intravenous heroin addict and things got really bad, and eventually was introduced to a situation that provided recovery for me. And so all of that in that process of getting sober, I really became, I was introduced to this concept of like service, of helping other people, and I became very passionate about helping other people. And for a while, I built a nonprofit. I was working in the jails where I was doing it was a 6-week restorative justice program, working one-on-one with inmates,
Interesting.
sort of taking some of what I had learned in recovery and packaging it in a way that I could teach them over the course of 6 weeks.
Interesting, yeah.
Had really good rates as far as reducing recidivism rates.
Uh-huh. And you just taught this class yourself, or you had other people?
I had other people, but essentially, like it was me and one other person. We would teach the class, and then, but ultimately, over the course of those 4 years, I realized that like. And I kick myself for not collecting data. Now that I'm a scientist, I could have easily just given them questionnaires. But essentially, I would say anecdotally, like 95% of the people I worked with had experienced trauma at a young age.
Of course.
That set the root for negative belief systems, maladaptive behavior patterns, and then they get in the system and it's not designed for them to get out, right? So that's what led me into neuroscience as far as like, I saw neuroscience as an outlet to potentially figure a way to get at whatever happens to the brain following trauma, stop it there before it becomes a psychiatric illness.
Okay.
And sort of sets the stage for somebody to go down one path versus the other.
You're saying that trauma can affect the brain and affect how the brain's structured chemically. I mean, is that
Correct.
a fair assumption?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm curious, what brought you to study alternative therapeutics within the context of all of this? And what promises do they hold that differ from traditional approaches?
In my past experience, I had my own experiences with psychedelics when I was using drugs, and even amidst like the nightmare of a life I was living, there were times where psychedelics would provide this like glimmer of hope. It would be a shift in my perspective.
Sure.
And so I had that little priming, but then as of over the course of the last, I don't know, almost 20 years now, there's been this resurgence of psychedelic research, and it seems that psychedelics are able to provide a rapid-acting and long-lasting shift for people. And what that amounts to, at least in clinical trials, we're seeing improvements in symptoms for a variety of different psychiatric disorders. And so I think, for me, it was like I was so interested in if there was a way to get to the root of trauma and stop it before it festers and becomes something else. That was what I was really interested in. That was how I saw a way to be able to help more people than I ever could one-on-one. And psychedelics at this point seem to offer the most hope for doing so, because it's like something about that experience for people allows them to almost like their brain becomes a little bit more malleable. They can kind of put down some subconscious defense mechanisms and get at the root of what's going on, as opposed to just a lot of our pharmacotherapies for these different disorders is just like putting a Band-Aid on a symptom versus like getting at the root. And in my experience in recovery, if you can get at the root, like for me, I did all this work and I got to some of the psychological roots that were like driving this, basically that were causing me to create a life that was so unlivable. I needed relief through drugs and alcohol.
Fear.
Right. and it's like once I did the work to solve that, I didn't want to use drugs anymore.
Do they have imaging of people that have trauma and how that shows up in the brain? Is that something that they've looked at?
So some things we know about what can happen is that people who have experienced trauma and later developed depression or generalized anxiety or PTSD, there's damage that occurs to the prefrontal cortex. Okay. And it whether it's like excitotoxicity, which is like when cells get overly stimulated and the cell death occurs, or cytokines. There's a variety of different mechanisms that can basically cause decreased activation or activity within the prefrontal cortex. And so the prefrontal cortex, as I alluded to before, has projections into this reward pathway. And so, if you can imagine that if those projections are weakened, it weakens the ability of the prefrontal cortex to stimulate some of the reward pathways. And that could be like, maybe the neurobiological underpinnings for like anhedonia, a loss of pleasure and depression, and the inability to have logical thought processes around anything pertaining to drugs of abuse for people who are struggling with a use disorder. And so we do know that exposure to trauma or stress and I guess you could look at it as a spectrum. The more insults that you have, the more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that you have, the greater the dysfunction can be. And it's not just in the prefrontal cortex, but that's one sort of example of which,
how trauma affects the brain.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, there's probably a lot of skepticism just from preconceptions and the war on drugs and all of this. How do you approach that in your field? And is that something that you have to encounter?
Yeah, so we're definitely fighting somewhat of an uphill battle, in that there's a lot of stigma with psychedelics, and so there's the access to be able to study these drugs is pretty restricted in research. You have to obtain a DEA Schedule 1 license, and so and then even just within the field, it's getting better, but there was a lot of stigma because psychedelics sort of represented this like hippie, less serious,
Yeah.
and so really since Roland Griffiths, who recently passed away, and the John Hopkins group began to do research in like early 2000s, where they came at it with a very like strict approach, and just by the data and science and very empirical approach to studying these compounds, that we started to see a shift.
Okay.
So it's one concern is that there's a lot of people who sort of have drank the Kool-Aid, if you will, and just want to believe that this is a sort of panacea for treating everything that you can think of, and I think that offers some problems for people in other fields, and it's really important for researchers like myself to remain skeptical and objective about this.
Of course. People don't realize that even the co-founder of AA also pursued some of these alternative therapies. What do you know about that, and how should people view that in the context of recovery?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people in that realm don't really like to discuss, right? Like it's mentioned in the text that one of these 12-step groups, I guess, that AA uses, the big book. It's mentioned in there that Bill W. underwent something called the belladonna treatment.
And then I remember crying out, if there is a God, will he show himself? And then came the miracle. The great central experience of my whole life. The room instantly lit up in a blinding glare of white light. I was seized by an ecstasy such as I had never known. It seemed to me that I then stood on a mountaintop where a great clean wind was blowing. I thought to myself, but this is not air, this is spirit. This is the God of the preacher. How long I remained in this state, I just cannot say. And again, I have no words to describe what it was like. At length, however, I found myself on the bed, but now I was in a new world. A world in which everything was right, despite the wrongs of the world I had been living in. I felt myself filled with the consciousness of the presence of Spirit, of God. A great peace stole over me. And there I lay and reveled in this new and loving consciousness.
Yes.
And basically, in that period of time, and this was like pre-LSD, one of the hallmarks of people that were going through the withdrawal, the delirium tremens or DTs, is that there would be hallucinations. They would be having hallucinations, and a lot of that has to do with alcohol withdrawal. Obviously, like when you pull the massive amounts of GABA that the brain had been used to, there's overexcitation, which can result in like seizures and hallucinations and all these things. And so psychiatrists at that time believed that that perhaps it was the hallucinations that were curing these people, because after they went through the DTs, some of them could be in recovery. So it's like that seemed to be the gateway from being an alcoholic to somebody who was clean or sober. They had to go through this period of having like the hallucinations.
Gotcha.
And so the belladonna it's a different type of psychoactive plant, but essentially it induced these sorts of like hallucinatory experiences. And so that very first spiritual experience that Bill W. talks about in Bill's story, where he sees this white light, he was on belladonna, right? And so people don't want to talk about that. And so later, Bill struggled with depression, and a lot of people do, right? Like you go
Sure.
through the 12 steps. The 12 steps or whatever, in my experience, were instrumental in me finding relief or recovery from the drugs and the alcohol. But there's a lot of other things, and I always encourage people, don't feel like you can't seek outside help for other things, because it's not a one-stop shop with the 12 steps. Sometimes you need to go deeper into other things. And so Bill had persistent depression, and so in the 50s, there were researchers at the Saskatchewan hospital that were doing clinical trials for alcoholism with LSD.
Is this the Sven Jensen?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so essentially, Bill Wilson had some experiences with LSD being administered through a psychiatrist, and basically wrote about having, his depression was lifted. He had really beneficial effects.
Yep.
And there were a lot of studies that from that era that were suggesting that psychedelics had therapeutic potential. Now the problem, some people will criticize this because those studies lacked some of the gold standard,
Sure.
like
There were
double-blind,
60
placebo
or 70
control.
years ago.
Right. But nonetheless, there was proof of, or some sort of therapeutic potential.
Okay.
And then ultimately what happened is there was research going on with LSD. LSD escaped the lab. People started to use it recreationally. It became involved and sort of intertwined in this counterculture movement. And then
Discredited.
yeah,
Essentially,
and then despite the fact that LSD, there were studies showing that LSD did not have a very high abuse liability, and it did have therapeutic potential, the government classified it as a Schedule I narcotic.
Yeah.
And by definition, a Schedule I narcotic is a high abuse liability with
Sure.
no medicinal value.
Yeah.
So by definition, LSD does not qualify to be under that category. But it was, for whatever reason, and I don't want to get into any sort of conspiratorial belief as to why that might have occurred.
And I think there's a reason why you can go through a gas station and buy a fifth of Jack, and
Yeah.
you can't, they'd rather you be dulled down than.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's circle back to the potential here. So how might some of these compounds not only heal the brain, but potentially facilitate a spiritual awakening?
Yeah, so I alluded to earlier that an effect of trauma could be, diminished activity within the cortex. And what we know about some of these serotonergic psychedelics, like LSD and psilocybin, they act on the serotonin system, among others, but primarily the serotonin system. And we know that those increase excitation, increase the activity of those prefrontal cortex and hippocampus neurons.
Okay.
So in some ways, it seems like that could be the point at which it's providing a restoration and maybe a dysfunction that somebody might have acquired following a trauma. I think that there's a lot more that we don't know about psychedelics. That it seems people have these like ineffable experiences that they feel like on some level they've connected with the source or God or whatever you may want to call that. And for me, I'm open-minded to all that. Like as far as I do science. I rely on empirical data, and I believe that a lot of this could be as a result of just pharmacology. But I'm also a skeptic, right? As a scientist, I need to remain skeptical. And if something cannot be disproven, then it's a possibility. Meaning, if somebody's having an experience and they're going into some other dimension, or they're having some sort of a relation with a higher power, I really can't disprove that. And it could very well be the case. This study called the Good Friday study, but essentially there's been a little bit of exploration in that direction. But I think in at large, the field is a little bit hesitant to go in that direction. Like that's almost like what the I don't want to say haters, but what the people that would be opposed to this area of research, they're almost just waiting for you to drop something like spirituality into the mix.
Because then it's not really.
Yeah, because they take it less seriously,
Gotcha.
right? Like we're at a stage right now where we need to win over the approval of the FDA, right? And the government, and they want real hard data. They want like real metrics, and so. There have been some experiences, especially the Johns Hopkins group, where they show that people liken these experiences to the most meaningful experiences of their life, spiritual experiences, and so on and so forth. I think, as far as how would we ever really be able to answer some of those questions, I'm not sure. But essentially, what we do know through human imaging studies is that drugs like psilocybin cause a breakdown of normal connectivity between, so under any given circumstances, there are certain parts of your brain that are communicating with each other more than other parts.
It's the default mode network.
That's one of the networks,
Yeah.
There's just these different networks that are like highly interconnected and segregated. And when you're on the psilocybin experience basically desegregates or like breaks down the within network. So the default mode network connectivity gets broken down, and then it encourages just global connectivity. So your brain regions are being connected in ways they normally never are.
Okay.
And so that, I think, is part of what puts the brain in this malleable state to where you can sort of, because it's like you can imagine psychiatric illness in essence is a result of hyperconnectivity between, and maybe dysfunctional connectivity between certain brain regions. Right? Somebody who has schizophrenia who might be having auditory or visual hallucinations, there might be too much connectivity between the parts of their brain that are involved in internal, like interoceptive thought, and auditory sensory input, right? And so that all of a sudden their thoughts are coming in as sensory input. Like they think they're hearing them.
Interesting.
Right? And so you can imagine that if a psychiatric illness is the result of dysfunctional connectivity, if you can disrupt that, it puts the brain at a place where you can maybe, when it comes back together, you can
it's like defragmenting it, sort of.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Devin, thank you so much.
Yeah,
man.
absolutely.
All right, thank you.